story of Jesus is strategically related to the story of Moses, but not just in minor parts, not just here and there, isolated, but that the whole macro structure of Matthew is based on an extended comparison between Jesus and Moses that shows not only that Jesus is like Moses, but even more striking, that Jesus is also like God. So Jesus is the God-man. He is the Redeemer like Moses, but he's also the God of Moses combined. And so when you start to read the Gospel of Matthew with this perspective of the deeds of the fathers, I think what it does is it unlocks the Gospels, and suddenly you start to see, hey, I never noticed that. And then, and then statements that we've kind of grown used to reading become striking. I'll give you an example. Let me give you an example. This is in Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Okay? Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, here's what's really shocking about this passage. Up until now, Matthew has been trying to show the ways in which the story of Jesus parallels Moses. So in chapter 2, Jesus is brought out of Egypt. In chapter 3, he goes through the waters of his baptism. Chapter 4, he goes out into the wilderness, and he's fasting for 40 days and 40 nights like Moses. Then in chapter 5, he brings his disciples up a mountain to give them the law. And so you see this comparison between Jesus and Moses. And then in chapter 11, suddenly Jesus has this invitation, right? This is a call to discipleship. Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Well, wait a minute. Once you recognize that Matthew is portraying the life of Jesus on the backdrop of the Torah, you suddenly are presented with something quite shocking. If Moses were to ever say, come to me and I will give you rest, we'd have to stone him. That's blasphemy. Right? Who's the giver of rest in the Torah? God. And yet Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. Now here's also what's really amazing. So in chapter 5, Jesus brings his disciples up the mountain. So we're saying, okay, he's going to deliver God's new law to the disciples, but Jesus doesn't give God's law. He gives his own law. In other words, he gives a law and he says, you listen to my words. Chapter 7 ends with the two ways. The two ways, the way of destruction or the way of life. If you listen to my word, you'll stand. If you reject my word, well, that's exactly the end of the Torah. God's two ways. And so you're shocked to see, wait a minute, he's like Moses, but he's so much more than Moses. And then in chapter 11, it's called a discipleship. And he says, and again, he says, take my yoke upon you. Now, for years, that statement baffled me. What does that mean, my yoke? I have no idea. What does it mean? Yoke, it doesn't sound very pleasant. But within the context of the first century, the rabbi spoke about taking the yoke of the Torah. And what they meant oftentimes was not just the Torah, but their interpretation of it. When Jesus says, take my yoke, let's replace the word yoke with Torah. My teaching. Take my teaching upon you. And learn from me. Once again, Jesus isn't saying, take God's yoke and let me be your teacher. He's saying, take my yoke. In other words, as soon as you start to realize that, as soon as you start to read the Gospel of Matthew within the concepts of the way that the Hebrew Bible works, one story paralleling another story, comparisons, contrasts, if you don't see that, you're going to miss some of the most amazing surprises of the Gospel of Matthew. And so The Gospel of Matthew, yes, Jesus is like Moses. But you know what? He's also identified in chapter 1 as God with us.
Right.
God with us. What does
Right.
Jesus say the last thing he says in the Gospel? And behold, I am with you always. I am with you.
Right.
How can he do that? Because he's God with us.
Yeah.